The topic of my talk is community cluster, adding clustering back to Liferay 7c. And as probably every one of you is aware, yesterday has been announced that it's officially brought back by Liferay itself. Nonetheless, before I start, let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Volker Fritsch. I'm from southern Germany, from Ulm to be exact. It's between Stuttgart and Munich. And I work for a company that's called Mercatis Information Systems. We do software, so we are a software developer, Java mostly. We excel in logistics. We do JE, portals, and we provide support and operations for our customers. I myself, have a strong professional background in Java EE, Liferay and OSGI. So, to give you a little bit of timeline about what I did. So, in April 2016, I read on the Liferay blog that Liferay itself is going to remove clustering support from Liferay 7 Community Edition. They said why they did it. I totally understand why they did it. And I thought to myself, okay, this is going to be interesting because I've never worked with Liferay Enterprise Edition. Not because I don't want to, mostly because there was no reason for me, or my customers had no EE licenses, they want to stick on Community Edition. So Community Edition is what I work with, and without clustering support, the move to Liferay 7, that's going to be a challenge. I had my first look at Liferay 7 at the DEVCON last year, and on the train to the DEVCON, I looked at the source code and I saw 3 packages or 3 modules that sounded interesting. What I did was I basically searched the code base for cluster, and I found portal cluster single, and then I thought, okay, single, this sounds nice, cluster single. And then I searched for single, and I found portal cache single and portal scheduler single. Then in March 2017, I started to tinker a little bit with the code base and thought, okay, how much effort would it be to do a proof of concept for myself to get clustering in the Community Edition back up and running? And I created 2 bundles in this proof of concept. It's portal cluster GMS and portal cache GMS. I didn't work with portal scheduler because for my proof of concept I didn't need that to have completely clustering in there. My proof of concept is merely a starting point. There's a lot of more work involved. Then in June 2017 I read about the cluster CE comeback, and I thought, okay, this is going to be great. So I'd rather prefer a community-backed and Liferay-backed solution than what I do in my office, because more eyes can fix more bugs. And this also motivated me to submit this talk to the DEVCON 2017, because most probably what I did in my proof of concept won't evolve anymore. I'm going to use the Liferay clustering support. And so this talk is a nice way to talk about what I learned and maybe educate you a little bit about how you could do something like that. It seems maybe really difficult in a timely manner. And yesterday I read the announcement on the Liferay blog that clustering indeed is back in the Community Edition. The source code is available. I've seen it last week already in GitHub. I haven't looked at it yet. I think they're going to merge it back in with the next GA or so. So my talk here is rather for entertaining purposes. So what happened back in March 2017? What I did was I had some time and I thought, okay, let's do a proof of concept if I can get clustering back up and running with the Liferay Community Edition. So I took my typical Liferay setup, which basically is I've got a Liferay, I've got a database, I use PostgreSQL, I have an NFS, so file system and an Elasticsearch server. And I set that up, and this is my typical setup, and it works. And what I did was I just spun up a second Liferay node. So I connected the second node against the same PostgreSQL. I connected it against the Elasticsearch, the same NFS. And obviously, this is not going to be a working cluster, but you have to start somewhere. And to find out what's broken or what's missing, this is a good starting point. And then I opened up two browsers, connected to both Liferay nodes, and started to adding web content. And what happens is it's obviously you've got a split brain situation. So the changes you do on the first node, you don't see that reflected on the second node. And this, you could restart the second node and then see the changes again, but if you start to change something on the second node, which you've already changed on the first node, and the second node is not aware of, you're really going into trouble. This is not good. And the reason for that is that we are missing communication between those cluster nodes. There is no communication at all. Why? Because it's not implemented. And we need cluster communication in order to fix cache replication. Cache replication basically means, or to get a step back, when I load up a site in Liferay, Liferay grabs down to the database and, for example, pulls an asset out of the database, renders that, and delivers it to the user. Liferay employees say, oh God, he has no meaning, but basically that's it. And in order for not every time to grab that stuff out of the database, Liferay is caching. So whenever you need some asset or something like that, Liferay looks into its cache, sees, okay, the cache is cold. I go to the database, get that stuff, put it into the cache, and the next request can use the cache. So my second node had an outdated cache. It didn't knew that I've changed something on the first node. And cache replication basically means that those nodes are talking to each other and are saying, okay, the cache on the first node, when I change something, commits or talks to all other nodes and says, okay, something changed in my cache. You need to invalidate this item, or you need to update it. And that's what's meant with cache replication, and we need that. And the second thing is what we need is a cluster executor. Cluster executor is basically as a means to execute methods on specific or all nodes in your cluster group. So those are the two basic mechanisms you need to implement to bring that back. And let's start with cluster communication. And now you might think, okay, cluster communication, this is hard. I read about it. There's stuff like Byzantine fault tolerance. There are gossip protocols. This is active science. There are guys in university who think about that all day, and this is terrible hard to implement. Yes, that's right. But you don't necessarily need to do it yourself. There are a lot of great libraries out there that you can leverage and base your own work on. If you look at Liferay 6.2, 6.1, at least in the community edition, they did not implement everything of that stuff themselves too. They use JGroups. And there are different frameworks like that. There's a Shoal framework, there's Infinispan, Hazelcast, EHCache, just to name a few. Some of those are rather caching frameworks, like EHCache and Infinispan. Some of those are rather group communication frameworks, like JGroups or Shoal. And some of them are a little bit in the middle of that, like Hazelcast. And I based my work on the Shoal framework. I did that because I've got exactly one servlet container I need to support, and that's Glassfish. And Glassfish uses Shoal framework as Shoal is a group communication. It's a group management service implementation of Glassfish. So Glassfish already has Shoal included and uses it for the exact same purpose, to keep nodes talking to each other. Shoal supports group communication, leader election. You get messages if nodes are entering your group or leaving your group, if nodes are missing, and you got everything you need to do messaging. And to show you how this works, basically, the upper two lines are I get myself a reference to a group management service, and then I add a listener. And every time I receive a signal, my listener gets spun up. And I can act on this message. And if I want to send a message, I get myself a reference to a group handle, and I use that group handle to send a message, that can be a string, that can be a serialized object, bytecode, whatever, to a specific channel that's called a component. So with that in place, I now have means to make my Liferay nodes talk to each other again. But I need to make them aware of that code. So those two are portal cluster single and portal cache single are OSGI bundles. They are loaded by Liferay's OSGI framework. So that's in the belly of Liferay. They are doing that work. So I have those packages available in my Glassfish application server, but I need to make Liferay's module framework aware of those packages so I can use them in my bundles. And in order to do that, you just need to add some lines to your Portal X properties. With that in place, you can add imports for those packages to your BND descriptors and have those packages available in Liferay and can start to using the GMS. So the next step would be to really tackle the cache replication. And in order to do that, I created a new bundle. I called it Portal Cache GMS. Name okay, I think. And I looked into Portal Cache Single. Portal Cache Single is a dummy implementation. It contains, I think, 3 classes that basically return null or false or stuff like that. But they tell a story. You see, okay, which interfaces should I implement? What are my calls I'm going to expect? What are my return values I need to provide? And with that knowledge, you get quite far. So the first thing I did was I implemented the interface Portal Cache Replicator Factory. That's a component. And it's used to bootstrap the Portal Cache Replicator. We got an interface for that, so we have our own implementation. And the Portal Cache Replicator has a lot of methods that are for replicating the cache. So for example, you've got a method that says, okay, notify everyone of a key removal. So we've got a key in our cache that is going to be removed, and I need to propagate that knowledge to my cluster. So what you're doing, or what I did was, I just implemented in that notify key removal a message to my GMS group with the following stuff. I marked it as key removal. I knew the name of the cache because Liferay has a lot of cache, because that's part of the method signature, and I included the key. And I did that for all 5, 6, 7 methods that are included in that interface. So now I can notify every cluster node of stuff that happens with caches. Next step would be to act upon it. So I implemented a third component that started on Bootstrap of the bundle, and that holds that gets a reference to Portal Cache Manager injected by the OSGI framework. And the Portal Cache Manager allows me to look up a specific cache by name and to call methods on that cache. For example, remove key. So whenever I receive a GMS message that says remove the key XYZ from cache main cache, I just can use the Portal Cache Manager to get a reference to the main cache and call the method remove key with the value XYZ. So with that in place, you've got cache replication, theoretically. The third step would be to implement the cluster executor. Here again, you've got a Liferay bundle that works as a blueprint. It's called Portal Cluster Single, and it contains several classes that are also dummy implementation. So for example, the cluster link class just returns null or false, I think. In my implementation, it just returns true to say I'm available. And then you need to implement the cluster executor and cluster master executor. Those are components as well. And also you've got methods that lead you, that say, okay, I've got a method that says execute method on every node. And you get a method reference, method invocation reference, and you can serialize that knowledge and send it via GMS to all your cluster nodes. And then you just need to implement a receiver that calls this method, or that acts on this method invocation. I kind of expected to find the OSGI whiteboard pattern at that place, because I'm in scope of a bundle. See, so I can only call methods of services that I depend upon. So I need to declare what I want to execute for the OSGI runtime to resolve that correctly. I don't know what method invocations I'm going to receive. So what I expected was the whiteboard pattern says, okay, if I want to be used, I make myself available. So I kind of expected different parts of Liferay to export or to register itself as an invocable service with the OSGI runtime, and then I could discover those services and just call them. This is not what I found. There was no such mechanism in place. So I read the source code of the module framework implementation, and I found a class that's called module framework adapter helper. And this basically reaches out to the Liferay kernel, and this part in return calls your invokes the method you want. So this is code that was available and that did exactly what I needed in this place, to be able to call any kind of code from within my bundle. With those two bundles in place, I just removed the portal single implementations, put my own stuff in there, started my two nodes, and hit some road barriers, which was to be expected. So it would have been too easy if it worked on the first go. So what I experienced was that the startup became slower and slower and slower until nothing worked anymore really good. And the reason for that was my first node sent, for example, a cache replication. Or on my first node, the cache entry was removed. So I received a call to send a cache key removal. I propagated that to my second node. My second node acted on that and removed the cache key. This led to method invocation on my second node to send a cache key removal request, and you get my drift. So those nodes were talking really good, and this was all they were doing. Second thing I experienced was a lot of class cast exceptions. I said that the method adapter invoker helper stuff helped me to call any part of Liferay code. But those method invocations I serialized and sent to my other nodes. To deserialize them, I had to load those classes that were in there. And my bundle couldn't couldn't call those methods directly because it has no reference to them, and it couldn't deserialize the objects because it has no access to their class loaders. So plain out of the book deserialization didn't work. I looked into Liferay if they've got any mechanisms for that around, and they have stuff like that. They have a serializer and deserializer. And you can use that to mitigate those effects. But in order to use them, you need to make your own classes available to the class loader pool. So with that, you get rid of the class cast exceptions. The infinite loops I introduced, those were more interesting. I figured, okay, you somehow need to differentiate between, okay, this key removal happened first on my node, or this key removal is a direct effect of a signal I received. And I figured, okay, this is a problem Liferay must have been solved in 6.1, 6.2, because they had clustering and the problem is the same. So I looked in the old source code and I found skip replication thread local. That's a thread local, so this value exists only in your thread, and you can use that to block that effect. So whenever you receive a message in your cache replicator, you just set skip replication thread local to true, and then cache key removal in the cache will not lead to calling your portal cache implementation. And when the signal handling is done, you set that back to false. And because it's a thread local, this value is only valid on your thread, so different threads can work concurrently. The same mechanism you need for the cluster executor. It's also in Liferay. It's a cluster invoke thread local. And with that in place and the module framework adapter helper, I basically managed to have a working POC. So I could spun up 2 instances of my Glassfish, 2 nodes, with those two bundles. And I could change web content on the first node and immediately see the result on the second node. Beware that this is a proof of concept I did. There's some differences. So I'm in the lucky position, this is a proof of concept, and I have only one servlet container I need to support. So this is a really comfortable situation compared to what Liferay is doing, because they have a waste amount of application containers and application servers they need to support, and a waste amount of use cases for that stuff. But my proof of concept worked. I gave them to colleagues of mine. They worked on that, but yeah, that's it. So what are my takeaways? Read the source code. Even if you think, okay, I don't know how to approach that, due to Liferay 7's modularity, you most certainly will find interfaces, packages, implementations that show you how things ought to be done. And most of us, I think, are Java developers, so we can read that code, we can learn from it, and we can leverage that knowledge. Don't be afraid to read legacy source code. Look into Liferay 6.1, 6.2 if you want to know how something evolved. If you have a hard time finding the right modules, say, okay, where did this come from? Where could this have been implemented in a former Liferay version? Look at that. See if you can recognize patterns in the new code. This really, really helps. Study existing solutions. You don't need to invent the wheel over and over again. There's a lot of great open source packages out there. And last but not least, make yourself comfortable with OSGI. OSGI is it provides I think it provides not that many mechanisms, but they are very, very powerful. After you've really understand how the service registry functions, how you do stuff where you formerly would have used listeners, so the whiteboard pattern, this really helps to build good applications and to understand how Liferay and the modularity framework itself works. And yes, Liferay is truly modular with 7. You can change it. You can add stuff like clustering back. And you could do a lot of different stuff. So that slide, I think it's only interesting if you download the presentation afterwards. There are links to the Liferay blog and to the different cluster single implementations. And finally, my contact information. You can reach me via email or via Twitter. I'm here today and tomorrow. I figure most of you will want to go to lunch soon, but I'll stick around here for a few minutes. And otherwise, I'm here. I'm mostly either drinking coffee or sitting in a talk. I'm pretty sure you're going to find me if you have any questions. If you want to see code or working prototype, hit me up. I'm glad to show that to you. But I won't do it on here because our time is limited.